Alright, welcome to our brief lecture about when and why people started living in cities. The slides are designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, we start talking about when and why people start living in cities. First thing we gotta talk about really is the why piece. Okay, and so what you see is, and this is development across time, so it's important to note a little bit about the history, is that in order for cities to develop, first you really have to have that first agricultural revolution, which, if you think back and remember to our agriculture unit, means that people had to start farming. And once people start farming, they settle down, and once they start to settle down, they build communities, and as they build communities and they become more efficient with farming, then they're able to support folks who are not farming. And it's from this development of agricultural surplus that we start to see the social stratification, which is a fancy way of saying the development of social classes, okay, that enables cities to stabilize and really grow. Within cities, we see the development of a leadership class, really an urban elite, where the decision makers who control the resources within the city and within the territories that the city controls. Oftentimes, these urban elites are the priests or the kings. Okay, and really, we get this. This all kind of starts out. The earliest ones that we see are in the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia, which is another way of saying the Middle East. And we think Fertile Crescent, modern day, what I want you to think is the areas in Iraq and Iran, specifically, largely those areas right around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I know they're all desert now, but it used to actually be a pretty major agricultural area. So, the development or the innovation of the city, we call that the first urban revolution, and it occurs independently in 6 separate hearths, okay, which is really its independent invention. So it happens in different places at different times, but it's not like it happens in one place and that causes it to then spread. And the reason that we know that this happened in different places at different times and that it happened independently is because the areas we're talking about are areas that are widely spread across space. And they're far enough apart that it's not of somebody who was banished from one city moving out and starting his own city. Okay? And those 6 urban hearths are also, again, closely tied to those agricultural hearths that we learned about in our agriculture unit. The other reason why we know they're independent inventions, by the way, is we're looking at spread across time. But when we look at where we're talking about, this will give you some idea of what I mean when I say they were so far spread out that what we're not seeing is diffusion, but rather independent invention, right? So we start out in Mesopotamia, which is another word for the Fertile Crescent. Again, Iraq and Iran right around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. About 3500 BCE, so that's about 5,500 years ago. Okay, then we see it develop next. Cities spring up in the Nile River Valley, which is in modern Egypt, and it's about 3200 BCE, which is roughly 5,200 years ago. Okay. Then the Indus River Valley, and the Indus River flows through modern-day India, and also, if I remember my geography correct, the Indus flows through, I think, Pakistan, about 2200 BCE, and so that's about 4,400 years ago. You can see what I was saying, by the way, if you pull out a world map, or if you know anything about geographic location of where these are, what I'm saying about space. Right? Next, cities spring up in the Huanghe, or Huanghe, I'm not quite sure, Valley, about 1500 BCE, so about 3,500 years ago. That's in modern-day China, by the way. Next hearth would be Mesoamerica. When we talk about Mesoamerica, really we're talking about Central America, kind of around the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay. That's about 1100 BCE, or about 3100 years ago. And then last but not least, we see them develop in modern-day Peru about 900 BCE, or about 2900 years ago. So we talk about when and why people start living in cities. Get a little more into the why. So we just talked about some of the when. Cities start to play a really key role in terms of developing societies. So they serve as economic nodes, right? Choose another way of saying they become kind of that chief marketplace. They become the center of economic activity. They also become the anchors of culture and society, focal points for power, authority, and also change. And they become focal points for power and authority partially because of the resources that are collected there, but also, and this is a key point about cities, the reason why culture springs up in cities is because cities are able to support, using their economic hinterlands, right, that agricultural land around the city, they're able to support folks who were not farming. And by not farming, that means they could be priests working in the temple, right? And so we see evolution in terms of religion. It could be the silversmith, or the iron worker, right, who's making tools and swords and plowshares and things like that. It could be the king. Okay. So because they're able to support all these folks who are not farming, they also create a lot of change and a lot of evolution. We're talking about ancient cities, and so a lot of the change that we see comes out of these cities and comes out of this idea that people literally have time and have energy to do things other than support themselves, and they're able to build and innovate based on that. So, talk a little bit about the spread of urbanization, right? So, and really we're going to talk about Mesopotamia, but the reality is we could use the same basic information and apply it to any of those 6 hearths that we talked about. So the populations grow steadily, in part because of the sedentary lifestyle, but also, while technically it's actually a little healthier to be a hunter and gatherer in terms of the variety that you eat, the trick with living in a city is that the food supply is steady, which means you don't have to worry as much about when the next meal's coming from. And as a result, there's fewer issues with things like malnutrition, and people live longer, they're healthier, they're physically larger, okay? And so populations grow slowly but steadily in those early cities. And as they grow, people do as people will. They move out of cities. And so then this idea of city spread, but not just the idea of cities, but also all the different things that go into cities, right? So they spread their knowledge of agriculture, and they spread their cultural knowledge, and their knowledge of economics, and things like that. So just to do a quick recap, we have been talking about when and why people started to live in cities. We looked at 6 major hearths of urbanization and talked about how these are independent hearths, which is really a fancy way of saying that they sprang up at different places at different times with no known way for them to have been connected. Pardon my cough there. So we talked about hearths in the modern day Middle East. We talked about hearths in India, in China, in Egypt, in Central America, and also in South America. And then we talked a little bit about what role cities play in terms of creating an economic center and also cultural and power-based centers, and what that meant for the folks who were trying to live in the cities, and how that then creates this constant change and really an evolution and development. So if you have any questions, I invite you to bring them into class, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have.